back to the podcast. I'm Jenna, your host. So, did we figure out what today's topic is? So, I crocheted this. Hopefully, you can see all the way around. What do we think this is? Any clues? Any ideas? Maybe, maybe not. So, we are going to start focusing on some folklore of different things, different entities, different creatures leading up into Halloween. So, the first topic we're going to discuss is witches and the folklore surrounding witches. So we've all seen movies and TV with witches, right? Witches being depicted. They typically have the long pointed hat. Sometimes they have like a very long nose, moles on their face, a broom. Sometimes they have what's known as a witch's familiar. Sometimes it's a cat, sometimes it's a dog, maybe it's a crow, maybe it's a raven, right? They usually have some sort of animal entity that is usually with them that is the witch's familiar, right? So we've seen these in movies like The Wizard of Oz, right? There was two witches in The Wizard of Oz. If you remember, the most famous one is probably the Wicked Witch of the West. She was green. She was the one that the house fell on her in the first few minutes of the movie, and all you see is her feet, and she shrivels up, right? So she shrivels up and she disappears, and everybody thinks, oh, good, she's gone, right? No, she ends up coming back, right? It was a little harder to get rid of her. The other one that we see is Glinda, the Good Witch. So we have the balance, right, of good and evil. So we see that in a lot of different things that are depicted about witches. Now, witches do tend to get a pretty bad rap in history. So we know full well about the Salem witch trials and things like that. We're not really going to cover that part in this. We're going to cover more of the folklore behind where do these things come from. Specifically, we're going to focus on the witch's hat, and that's why I made one. So I made it to where it can also be folded over. The top part here, the cone, can be folded over and pinned down, and then it can be worn as just a beanie. Now, I did put a bunch of different charms on here. The charms were significant to me for a reason. So I put those on there. I wear hats a lot in the wintertime when it's cold. You guys will see that. So you might catch me wearing that here and there. So for Halloween, we are going to be doing some episodes going forward into spooky season about different things. We're going to cover some werewolves. We're going to cover some vampires. We're going to cover ghosts, witches, and who knows what else, whatever else I come up with. So if you have any suggestions for things that fit into the spooky side of things for folklore, drop me a comment down below and let me know. So let's get into this. Why are we talking about the hat specifically? Well, the hat is something that most people would say is like a symbol of witches, right? That it's making them identifiable. So where did it come from? And what does it, more importantly, what does it symbolize? So, a witch's hat symbolizes various concepts, including wisdom and intuition. So, if you think of the cone is pointed up, right? And our crown chakra is what allows us to tap into our intuition. So, truth be told, that the cone is actually like, think of a megaphone, right? You yell into this thing and it spreads, right? So it's the opposite. The cone, the pointy part, is pointing up and then it spreads into our intuition. So that is part of what it symbolizes is wisdom and intuition. As its point is believed to channel energy between the earth and the sky, it also symbolizes otherness and being set apart from the norm, initially stemming from stereotypes associating certain headwear with groups like Jews or independent alewives. We're going to cover what an alewife is. Over time, the hat evolved into popular culture to represent a blend of magic, mystery, and sometimes the subversion of traditional gender roles. So, part of it is connecting to wisdom, right? And we see witches were typically seen as healers, but they typically were ostracized. So, maybe they were the crazy old lady out in the woods, right? That nobody dared to go near because rumors would fly. Oh, she'll eat your children. Oh, she'll do this, she'll do that, right? But really, they were healers. And so they were kind of pushed to the edge of society because Christianity started to take over and witches were deemed as evil. So let's discuss the symbolism of the pointed hat. So there's wisdom and intuition. The tall, pointed shape is sometimes seen as a conduit, channeling spiritual energy from the heavens to the earth, connecting the wearer to higher knowledge. Otherness and nonconformity. The hat's design made the wearer stand out, a trait used to identify and ostracize those who deviated from societal norms, whether they were accused of witches or members of certain religious groups. There was also magic and mystery attached with the hats and witches in general. The hat became a cultural signifier for magic, not only as a way to evoke the mystical, but also to create an aura of the mysterious and the unknown. So I feel like for a lot of people, it was more of a symbol that was used to identify. Like, let's say you go to the regular store and they wear uniforms, right? So you can identify who works here and who is just a shopper. So things like that. When we get to the part where we're going to discuss the alewives, the hat was very symbolic for being able to identify those. So we'll get there in just a moment. So there was a lot of magic and mystery that surrounded the hat, and the hat became a cultural signifier for magic, not only as a way to evoke mystical, but also to create an aura of the mysterious and the unknown. It's also a symbol of feminine power. The image of the witch in a pointy hat also represents strong, independent women who operate outside of established systems, symbolizing freedom and power. So these also would have been kind of the rule breakers, right, in society. They weren't following the rules, they weren't trying to fit in, they weren't trying to blend in and disappear. No, quite the contrary. They were trying to set themselves apart and not blend in. So there's some historical origins in the Bronze Age. The cones were seen starting in the Bronze Age. Similar conical hats were worn by priests in the Bronze Age to predict the stars, and these are thought to represent magical or divinatory powers. So, the Bible definitely frowns upon all of these things that we're going to talk about. It talks about you shouldn't seek counsel with witches. You should stay away from all of that. You shouldn't dabble in the occult. You shouldn't deal with mediums and psychics and things like that, right? So, I mean, you make up your own mind, but I definitely feel like they were people who were just everyday people and they kind of got looped into this group and demonized and told, oh, they're bad, stay away from them. And we've seen that throughout history that certain demographics are picked on and ostracized and things like that. So, let's talk about the medieval alewife. What is that? Where have we heard that before? Have we heard that before? All right. So, the conical hats worn by alewives, who were women in the brewing trade, may have become associated with witchcraft after they were accused of selling adulterated beer. Okay, so an alewife would have been somebody who was part of like the brewmasters. And we see a lot of this in medieval times where they would have had like um, the lodge or the bar, the saloon, things like that, where people would go and they'd gather, they'd drink, they'd eat, things like that. And so these women were participating in helping to brew the beer. So in the marketplace, they would have worn these conical hats in order to see them over the crowd so you could migrate your way to their like booth or their little spot in the market. There's also a Jewish affiliation with the hat. The hat gained negative connotations as it was sometimes forced upon Jewish people, and those who practiced non Christian activities were also forced to wear pointed caps. Witchcraft accusations. The image of witches wearing pointed hats became popular in England after 1700, likely taking hold and spreading through popular culture and literature. So we start to see imagery in older texts of these things, right? And it's like, so where do all these things start? Well, this was kind of the start of where these things became more mainstream, more popular, and more seen. So why are their hats pointed or conical? So witches wear pointy hats due to cultural and visual associations rather than any actual magical purpose. The image likely evolved from historical persecution of figures like Quaker women and was popularized by Victorian fairy tale illustrations and media to easily identify witches as dangerous or magical outsiders. The hat serves as a visual shorthand, making witches stand out as a symbol of wickedness, fantasy, and the supernatural. So, some symbolic meanings and cultural origins. It's an easy identifier visually. Pointy hats are widely recognized for a cultural cue for witch in media, costumes, and art. Historical connections. The Pointy Hats association with witchcraft likely stems from real historical clothing and superstitions. Quaker hats during the 17th century, Quaker women who were often viewed with suspicion by Puritans wore wide brimmed black conical hats. Now, I will include some photos at the end of this so you can see they were similar, but they were not the same. So instead of it being a complete point at the top, like how we traditionally see these, it was more kind of a blunt end at the top, like this. And if you remember history, when we were kids growing up, right, the Puritans and the Quakers all came over here to the New World, right? And so they were trying to like start a new life over here, all these things. So their hats would have been something that came with them from the old world, the old country. And yes, it looked similar, but not identical. So that's something that I think stands out. A dunce hat. Do you remember hearing about those when you were kids? The tall conical shape also resembles the dunce cap, a hat worn by heretics, which was associated with those who defied religious authority. A dunce cap would look very similar to the witch's hat, except without the wide brim going around. It was more of just a cone on top with a long point on it. And if I remember the stories correctly that my parents and grandparents used to tell me, is that when they were young, when they were in school, if somebody had made a mistake and they were being a distraction to class, the teacher could sit them in the corner with this hat on, basically telling everybody that they were stupid, that they had messed up, that they were a dunce. And so that's where the dunce cap came from. In Victorian fairy tales, illustrations in Victorian fairy tales and children's books cemented the image of the pointy hat as a quintessential part of a witch's appearance. So in fantasies, they are a conduit for power. In a purely fictional context, some theories suggest that the hat's shape could be seen as a funnel to draw down or direct magical energy from spiritual realms. I'll leave that to you to decide. Wisdom and intelligence. The conical shape is sometimes interpreted as a symbol of wisdom and intelligence, a concept that also linked to the original dunce cap, right? So if you had to wear the dunce cap because you were being a dum-dum, right? Because you were doing stupid stuff you shouldn't be doing, well, then it's kind of the opposite of that, right? If we think that the witch's hat is to draw in wisdom, well, then that would be the opposite of the dunce hat. Food for thought there. All right, so reality versus the stereotype. The stereotype of the witch wearing a pointy hat is a product of cultural and historical factors rather than a description of the real world witchcraft practices. The image became a powerful symbol, but its roots lie in prejudice and the need to easily distinguish marginalized groups like Quaker women from the broader society. So, again, we already had some segregation type stuff going on. We were sectioning out certain demographics of people, and I do feel like that's kind of continued throughout history with a lot of different things going on. So let's talk about the folklore. The folklore of the witch's hat suggests its roots are in the medieval forced imposition of a conical hat on Jewish communities to identify them, and a similar pointed cap worn by some women to distinguish themselves at markets, evolving from a symbol of societal status to a mark of otherness, and eventually the iconic magical headwear in popular culture. Its conical shape might also symbolize channeling magical energy upwards or simply serve as a distinctive element of the witch in art and literature. So, what do you think? Do you think that it's something that stands out? Do you think that it's something that is synonymous at this point with identifying witches? I think most people, if they saw someone wearing that, they would immediately think they've got to be a witch, right? So, what are the historical and cultural roots? The Jewish identification in medieval Europe, particularly after 1215, a papal decree required Jews to wear a special identifying hat. This pointed cap, a Judenhut, became associated with this marginalized group and potentially contributed to the negative perception of pointed hats. So that's one of them. Women's hats. In some parts of medieval Europe, pointed hats also symbolized social standing or marked women who were considered other. Some traditions associate these hats with herbalists and beer brewers, known as alewives, who wore them to be seen above the crowds in markets. So if you think of an outdoor market, right, we still have some of those today, like a farmer's market or a festival where things are really busy and there's crowds of people. Well, if you're standing and you're short, right, because I'm like 5'4", so I'm not super tall, but if I'm standing and my cone is pointed up, you could probably see the top of this hat from the crowds of people. So that was one of the reasons why they started to wear these. Let's see. Let's see. So symbolism and folklore. Let's see. Nope, I lost my place. Apologies. Okay, so they wanted to be able to be seen over the crowd, make them easily identify the target, and over time the association with being different or marginalized became linked to the image of the witch. So, focal point for magic. In later folklore and popular culture, the hat's point is sometimes interpreted as a way for witches to channel and direct energy or connect to spiritual or magical realms. So you guys already know that I channel, right? That's part of my gifts and my abilities that I have is I channel information. Where does it come from? It comes from spirit, right? So it comes into my crown, into my third eye, and then I interpret it and vocalize it, right? So the top 3 chakras are definitely being affected when I channel. So let's just say, let's say for shits and giggles, that the top of the hat, the cone, was actually a conduit and you were actually able to draw in that energy through that and into your third eye and use the information. How do we know that's not really a real thing? It might be for all we know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'll leave you to decide. So it was also a mark of mystery. The iconic image of the tall pointed hat, often black, became a deeply embedded cultural symbol of mystery, the occult, and magic. A later evolution of the explicit connection of the black pointed hat to witches in popular culture is a more recent development, solidifying in stories, movies, and of course, Halloween imagery. So, every Halloween, wherever you are in the world, in America, we celebrate Halloween on October 31st. In other parts of the world, they call it All Hallows Eve, Samhain. There's probably more names for that. Day of the Dead. I can't remember how to say that in Spanish, but there's many different times of the year towards the end of October that we start to honor people that have passed, the dead. And so certain cultures celebrated those. They'd set a plate at the table, they'd leave treats out, they'd leave, beer or wine out for their deceased loved ones, flowers, candies, what you name it. So they left an offering basically for the deceased loved ones. So that was kind of how things came about for Halloween. We are going to do an episode about Halloween, so I don't want to get too far into that. But the witch's hat in general started to become a symbol and an identifier of these people that were rumored to be witches. The witch's hat in nature is typically seen as a mushroom, so a little bit different. I did find a cool picture of that, but I don't think I'm going to include that in here. The term witch's hat also refers to hieroglyphy conica. I don't know why I'd even tried to say that. A species of mushroom whose sharply conical shape gives it a distinct appearance and lends itself to the imagery of mystery and the occult. So just think of a mushroom that would have had like little fans all around the top, and you can picture, right, a little mushroom has a little bit of a point, a little shorter and round, and so it's got kind of the brim like the witch's hat would have. What is the history of the ale hat? The tall black hat was thought to be part of an unofficial uniform for brewers to help them to stand out in a public marketplace. Alewives like witches were usually depicted as either youthful temptresses or old crones. So we have, what is it? Maiden, mother, crone are the three stages that are usually depicted. I want to say it's Hecate usually is seen with having like three heads as well, with her hellhounds, and Hecate we are going to talk about as well in this episode. So why did brewers wear pointy hats? Why? How come? Besides being able to be seen, right? Some historians think the pointy black hat stemmed from similar headwear worn by the medieval alewives who dominated England's brewing trade and occupied a position on the fringes of society to help them to be seen in the marketplace, right? And so we've already established that if you're short in stature and there's a crowd of people, you might typically be able to see the top of that hat over the crowd of people. So that started to be a reason to wear them. What is an alewife in medieval times? In medieval times, an alewife was a woman who brewed and sold ale, a common and important occupation, particularly in England. These women, also known as brewsters, brewed ale in their homes for sale, establishing a vital part of the local economy. Their businesses often served as informal alehouses with a stake over the door indicating the availability of their beer. So they would have been like entrepreneurs, right? Way back when. So they would have participated in making and selling of all of the ale or the beer. In which folklore, which folklore features diverse figures such as the ancient witch of Endor and Slavic Baba Yaga, often depicted as magical, old, and sometimes malevolent women who possessed powers like flight, potions, and familiars, sometimes embodying wisdom and healing, other times representing the dangerous unknown. In Western European folklore, particularly during the witch hunts, witches were associated with pointed hats, dark clothing, and broomsticks, and were accused of pacts with the devil and performing evil deeds. So, slowly over time, things evolved from where it was just part of how people dressed back then, the alewives or the Puritans, things like that, with these pointy hats that nobody thought anything of. All of a sudden, it started to become something other than that. It started to turn into, oh, maybe they're doing things that are dangerous. Oh, maybe they're creating potions that are poison. Maybe they are, sacrificing children or whatever crazy made up stuff that they were doing. So there were some common themes in witch folklore. One of those being magical abilities. Witches are known for various magical abilities, including casting spells, brewing potions, flying on brooms or other means, and communicating with spirits or animals. Now, I will tell you, as somebody who I would call myself a witch at this point, but I consider myself to be a healer, not anything dangerous, dark, or destructive. So, the whole casting spells. Why did they call it spelling tests when we were kids growing up? Do you remember those? Do you remember having to study the words and take spelling tests? When you speak, you create. Look up the word abracadabra. It literally translates to as I speak it, I create it. So we were being taught from a very young age how our words have power, right? So are you creating incantations and spells with your words? Your intention definitely matters. So some magical abilities, spells, brewing potions, right? We're going to go into the different types of witches and what they practice. And maybe you're going to see that you have a little bit of witchiness to you too. Maybe you're a little witchy, maybe you're a little woo-woo. All right, so flying on brooms. That one I feel like was one that was more for like Hollywood movies and things like that. I don't know for sure that any witches ever actually flew on a broom, but maybe I'm wrong. All right, so they could have also communicated with spirits. I'm a channeler, I'm a medium, so I communicate with spirits on a regular basis, as well as animals. You guys will see my dogs in videos and things like that. They're my kindred spirits, and we definitely have a bond. So let's talk about familiars. Many folk tales, including the concept of familiars or spirits, often in an animal form like a black cat or a dog, that serve as a witch's companion or helper. Now, there are times when I'm in here pulling tarot cards, and Magnus, the puppy, will come in and he'll nudge the cards with his nose. And on occasion, he has pulled some cards that really do have some meaning. So, I do think that a lot of times it was just their companion, their pet that they had, and they form a bond, right? If you've ever had animals, you know that that's not a hard thing to do. You love it, you feed it, you care for it, and so you form a bond just like you would with a child. So I do believe that witches would have had familiars. And appearance. In many traditions, witches are depicted as ugly, old, or frightening women, especially with physical marks such as moles or red hair. Now, I don't remember seeing too many witches that looked like they had red hair, but typically they would have a beauty mark of some kind. Typically, they would have a big hunched nose, or they would have warts or moles somewhere on their face, right? They were meant to look frightening. They were meant to look hideous, right? To keep people afraid, to keep people away from them. But the witches in real life that you meet look like you're just your everyday person. So, how do you really tell who's who? All right, so they have an association with evil. Witches are frequently portrayed as malevolent figures who use their powers for evil, causing bad dreams, inflicting harm, or making pacts with demons. Now, I personally don't work with demons. However, I have had a few encounters with some. So, I try and keep those things at bay. I've also had some otherworldly entities like Lilith come through and offer protection from the lower realms or demonic forces and darkness. So you just never know who you're really working with on the other side unless you have dug deep and done some work. Association with nature. In other traditions, particularly in older folklore and contemporary folk magic, witches are associated with nature, healing, and wisdom, acting as wise women or folk healers. And I would say that's kind of the demographic that I sort of fall into is I love to share knowledge. That's how the podcast came about, is sharing knowledge about things. And I thought these would be kind of fun topics to share as well as healing. And so all of my readings that I do, whether it's tarot or mediumship, is with the premise in mind that we are going to generate some information to facilitate healing somewhere in your life. So that's always what I strive to do. There is some symbolism with witches. Witches can symbolize the unknown, the challenging of societal norms, or the forces of nature embodying both fear and fascination. So I feel like they were meant to be feared, right? Because they were the others or they were ostracized in society for a very long time. And so I feel like a lot of them would have just kind of set up shop someplace out in the middle of nowhere where they could just do their thing and be left alone. I feel like they were kind of sought out for their knowledge for a long time, whether it was in like hidden means or whether it was a little bit more public, like probably now more public than hidden. So, some examples of witches in folklore include the Witch of Endor, an ancient witch from the Bible whom King Saul consulted to summon the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel. So, she is mentioned in there. Baba Yaga, a fearsome, sometimes malevolent hag from Slavic folklore who flees in a mortar who flies in a mortar and is known for her magical hut and connection to the forest. Hags and mares. In Norse and Celtic mythology, the term hag, mare, and mara refer to figures who torment sleepers or bring winter, often with physical staff-like tools. Interesting. So there's several different types of witches. So we're going to discuss a little bit of the different main types. Now there may be more than this. These are just some ones that we're going to touch on. So there isn't a definitive list of the 12 types of witches, but common categorizations include styles based on their practice focus, such as the green witch, focusing on nature and plants, a kitchen witch, a domestic magic and food, a hedge witch, spiritual and ancestral realms, cosmic witch, astronomy and astrology, an eclectic witch, combining various traditions. Other types include urban witch, a city-based witch, tech witch using technology, a crystal witch using crystals, and a hereditary witch using family traditions. So a green witch focuses on nature, plants, and the environment, often working with herbs and making natural potions. A kitchen witch incorporates magic into cooking and food, bringing sacredness to the home throughout culinary practices. A hedge witch connects with ancestral spirits and the spiritual world, often having shamanic influences. A cosmic witch works with celestial bodies, the moon phases, and astrological events in their practices. An elemental witch focuses on the four classic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So, out of just those five, I would say that I am a green witch, a kitchen witch, a hedge witch, and a little bit of a cosmic and elemental witch. I use a little bit of all of that in everything that I do, right? It's like I'm a Pisces, so we're the last, so we have little bits and pieces of everything within us. The crystal witch, utilizing the healing and energetic properties of crystals in their magical work. I also incorporate crystals. The urban witch practices in a city environment, adapting their craft to modern city life and materials. I live in the city. A tech witch uses modern technology in their magical practices. We do use the internet because it is fabulous. And belief and community focused types. So, the eclectic witch, a witch who draws from various magical traditions, belief systems, and cultures to create a personalized practice. So, almost like, you're picking and choosing the things that you want to incorporate into whatever workings that you're doing, whether that's spell casting, creating food, using the elements, whatever you happen to do, it would be creating it to make it your own. Hereditary witch, a witch from a family lineage where witchcraft has been practiced for generations. Now, I would say that's maybe a little bit more rare now than maybe it used to be, but we're passing down the wisdom, right? Maybe your great grandparents were people who knew how to use sacred herbs for medicine, right? And maybe they were healers in their community. And so those things would have been taught to each future generation so that they knew how to heal with herbs, with nature, things like that. Maybe it's something where technology advanced, and so we're learning how to use different technology and we're passing down that wisdom, however that happens to work out. All right, so let's see. Hereditary witch. The solitary witch practices their witchcraft alone outside of a formal coven. I would fall into that. I don't work with other witches. A coven witch practices with a group of witches known as a coven, and a secular witch practices witchcraft without religious ties, separating it from spiritual or religious beliefs. So, as you can see, there's quite a bit of difference between all of those. However, they all have their part in making up what witches actually do. So, what is it that 13 witches are called? A coven. All right, the word coven from Anglo Norman covenant, couvent, from Old French covent. Oh, geez, it's just going to keep spitting these out. Latin, let's see. So, several different languages we have used the word, and it translates into coven. Used mainly until 1921. When Margaret Murray promoted the idea that all witches across Europe met in groups of 13, which they called covens. So 13 is a number that is synonymous with the divine feminine energy. So 13 used to be how many months we had on a calendar until things were changed. So 13 coincided with 28-day cycles for women's menstrual cycles, and 13 is how many months we technically should have, but we do not. We have changed it to 12. We also had, I want to say it was 13 zodiac signs. I could go on a tangent about all these things, why 13 is significant. 13 was the number that they associated with the witch's coven. So it was marking the divine feminine energy. So what is said to kill witches? Fire being one of them, right? We've all heard of the Salem witch trials where women were burned at the stake accused of witchcraft, right? And so supposedly that was one of the only ways. Hanging was another one that they used to do, but either way that it worked out, it wasn't good for anyone accused of witchcraft. So, in folklore, killing witches, burning them at the stake, perhaps the most infamous method. I don't know why words are so hard today. Burning was believed to one, purify the witch's soul and preserve it as a deterrent for others. So, right, no one wants to sit there and watch somebody be burned alive, so they were hoping it would deter people. Drowning tests was another one, known as swimming a witch. The method involved throwing a suspected witch into the water, and if they could swim, I think if I have this right, if they could swim and they didn't drown, then they were a witch. And if they drowned, they were just a person, right? So crazy. So a lot of people were either burned or they were drowned or hung. Awful. All right. So who protects the witches? Well, Hecate. So Hecate is a goddess in Greek mythology associated with magic and witchcraft. She was considered the teacher of witches, but also had the power to protect against witchcraft. So I don't know a ton about Hecate, but the stuff that I have learned about her is that she is the one that's usually represented with maiden, mother, crone, the three stages of being a woman. So the maiden would be the young girl as she transitions into womanhood. The maiden is like the young woman, usually like roughly early 20s into like middle age. And then the crone is the wise old woman, right? We see her, the hunchback, the pointed nose, the warts and the gray hair and all these things. That's typically depicted of what we know as modern witches, right? We usually see them as the haggard old crone. And so the crone comes with all the knowledge. The crone is the one that has lived through all those stages, has mastered all of the knowledge, and is the keeper of all of that, and hopefully able to share those things. She's also past the point of having children, so she's much older, much more advanced in age. And so at this point, I identify with the crone. So this crone is here to help you share some knowledge. So I hope you enjoyed this little folklore trip down memory lane of witches. So if you guys have any topics that you want to add to the folklore list, we're going to have these all in a series leading up to Halloween. So let me know, drop a comment. What do you want to know the folklore of? We are going to do a couple of them leading up into Halloween, and then we'll probably do one about Halloween and how all that came about. So, are you a witch? Do you fit that? Are you a healer? Would you have been one that they tried to like hide down and, hunt you down and burn you at the stake many, many years ago? Are you still a closet witch, or have you come out of the broom closet? Have a wonderful week.